Well, welcome to our Water with Your Lunch. My name is Andy Mueller. I'm the general manager at the Colorado River District. I want to just welcome you to our, I believe, fifth installment of Water with Your Lunch. Today, as I think many of you are aware, we intend to talk about what's up with hedge funds or investors in the Grand Valley. We want to first state that, as indicated in our publicity on this event, we did reach out and invite the founder of Water Asset Management, Disque Deane, to come and speak with us and provide his perspective on investments and their intentions with respect to the community in the Grand Valley and Western Colorado. We invited Mr. Deane a few weeks ago, and a very nice, polite gentleman. On Sunday, unfortunately, he declined to participate in today's discussion. He did offer up the involvement of a paid spokesperson, which the district felt was not a good exchange. We were looking for a principal from Water Asset Management to help us understand their investments. And so we are today, instead of having Water Asset Management's principal, Disque Deane, present, we have invited Luke Runyon, who is a reporter with KUNC out of Fort Collins, Colorado. He is a Colorado River reporter and has done lots of in-depth work on the Colorado River and some of the hydrologic and political happenings. He has also been recently done a collaborative journalism piece on investments by Water Asset Management and others in Western water. And his knowledge and time that he's invested will be really helpful, I think, to help explain what's going on the not only in Western Colorado, but in the Western United States with respect to some of these investments. We also today, as advertised, do have Representative Marc Catlin. Marc Catlin will be speaking today on providing a perspective that only a farmer turned General Assemblyman can provide. Marc is a former manager of the Uncompahgre Valley Water Users Association, one of our biggest, if not the biggest, irrigation projects in Western Colorado. Marc is a lifelong family farmer, multi-generational operation down in the Montrose area. And as a General Assemblyman and frankly as a board member on the Colorado River District, has lots of experience with water in Western Colorado. I do want to provide just a brief overview of what we think at the Colorado River District is driving some of the discussions about investments in the river and in our irrigated agriculture. I think it's important to put this into a historic context, if you will. Between the 1922 Colorado River Compact and the 1944 treaty with Mexico, our predecessors legally apportioned approximately 17.5 million acre feet of water on an annual basis. So that there was a firm belief in 1922 that there was well over that 17.5 million acre feet. In fact, many at the time purported to believe that there were 20 million acre feet there. As is pointed out by some of the recent scholarly work, there were also hydrologists back then who said, no, you guys are way off. It's far less than what you're saying. But over the last 21 years, we've experienced a highly unusual, although not unique, drought in the Colorado River system. And that hot drought that we've experienced has resulted in a natural flow at Lee Ferry, the dividing line between the upper and lower basin, of approximately 12 to 12.5 million acre feet a year. So roughly 5 to 5.5 million acre feet a year less than what has been apportioned by our legal documents. Even worse, science predicts that flow could drop as low as 11 million acre feet within the next 50 years. The major reservoirs on our system, Powell, which is the upper basin savings account, which is designed to protect our upper basin consumptive uses, sits below 50%. Meade today sits around 40% of its full capacity. They were both full when we entered this century 21 years ago. Given the differential between the flow of the last 21 years and what we have legally apportioned, apportioned. It's remarkable that the reservoirs even have this much water in them, frankly. Why is that? Well, I think we need to recognize that the upper basin has never consumed its full 7.5 million feet a year entitlement. In fact, our consumptive uses in the upper basin are estimated to be 4 to 4.25 million acre feet a year, and that's in Utah, New Mexico, Wyoming, and Colorado. So we've used less water than our documents say we're entitled to. And even the lower basin, which has chronically taken more water than it's entitled to, has made significant cutbacks in the last few years and brought its water use down. Those two factors, the historic underuse by the upper basin and the recent efforts by the lower basin, have brought that system close to balance over the last couple of years, but it's frankly in a very tenuous situation. In fact, I view it as being a system that is being kept on the edge of a crisis. With our reservoirs this low and the potential of this ongoing drought to continue well into the future, and frankly, drought is probably the wrong term for that. It's an extended period of aridification. It's caused by a warming trend that doesn't seem to have any end. It is, as many people refer to it, an effect of climate change. We have less water in the river. And so, you know, the question is, if we're in a crisis, what does that mean? Well, as any historian of natural resources will tell you, that when there's a crisis in the supply of any natural resource, that crisis presents an opportunity for savvy investors to make money in dealing in that commodity. Many people in the Colorado River Basin believe that the study by the state of Colorado and the Upper Colorado River Commission and our fellow Upper Basin states, our study of demand management is something that has encouraged or potentially given hope to investors that there's a market to be developed in this commodity, this water of the Colorado River. I want to talk about demand management a little bit. It's a term that's thrown around quite a bit in the Colorado River these days. It's really, in the context of the Colorado River, at least in the upper basin, it is a proposed program to be the intentional reduction of our consumptive use of water in the upper basin states. And the intention would be that we would reduce use and be able to calculate, monitor, verify that use, and place that water, that excess water or saved water, into a new special storage account that's available in Lake Powell and the other upper basin, Colorado River Basin Storage Project reservoirs. That's the intention. So we have the storage account set up. It's a storage account that is not subject to balancing or equalization. So it doesn't automatically get sucked down the river if the lower basin uses too much water. But in order to fill that, we have to intentionally reduce our use and forego the use of that water for some period of time. The state and others involved have said, look, if we're going to do that program, it needs to be temporary. It needs to be compensating the water users for foregoing their water use. And it needs to be voluntary. There have been lots of discussions about what that might or might not do to the economies of Western Colorado and the state of Colorado as a whole. There are discussions about whether or not that storage account would be enough. And let me say, the only reason the upper basin would engage in these types of activities is to create an account or a pool of water that would help us protect our consumptive uses from being curtailed as a result of a violation of the 1922 compact. We've never violated the 1922 compact. We've always delivered the water that's called for in that compact at Lee Ferry. In fact, we have a surplus of delivery going on right now on our rolling 10-year average. So it's a potential, it's a possibility. We'd like to see it not develop into a probability that we would actually violate the terms of the compact or the obligations contained therein. The question is this demand management pool the tool that we should be using in the Upper Basin? Are there other tools to be developed that could also help us? But today we want to focus on the fact that this demand management program, there have been many that have said that the very discussion about that program have opened the door to something we haven't seen on the West Slope before, and that's large-scale corporate investment in irrigated agriculture. We have historically had small family-owned, multi-generational operations throughout the West Slope, producing local food and fiber. And today there's lots of discomfort, frankly, from the local community about what this corporate investment portends. And with that kind of setting the table for this discussion, I'd like to introduce again Luke Runyon, a reporter for KUNC, who hopefully can shed some light on the facts that he was able to uncover and the stories that he and his fellow reporters, and Luke, if you want to name all of them, and I don't want to just give you credit because I think it was a wonderful series you guys put out, and I imagine an ongoing effort. So with that, Luke, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy, and good afternoon, everyone. Like Andy said, my name is Luke Runyon, and I'm a reporter for KUNC. I run a project that focuses on the Colorado River Basin for a network of public radio stations throughout the Southwest. Basically, if there's a city that relies on the Colorado River, there's a good chance that they have one of our member stations there. And I guess I'm sort of pinch hitting this webinar since we had someone who declined an invitation earlier this week. But when Andy invited me to come on here, we thought it would be helpful for me to talk just a little bit about how the story that we ended up publishing and the series that we ended up publishing came to be. And if you hear some thudding in the background while I'm talking, there was a lot of snow here on the Front Range in Fort Collins, where I live, and it's melting and sort of hitting my roof right now. So if you hear that, don't be alarmed, it's just snow. So I first heard about water asset management in 2017, and I read about their first initial purchase of an agricultural property in the Grand Valley in the Grand Junction Sentinel. Dennis Webb, a reporter there, I believe, did a story about this kind of unusual purchase. It's not very often that you get an investment firm from New York City coming to the Grand Valley to be buying up agricultural land, so it raised some eyebrows. And ever since I saw that story, it's been something in the back of my mind that I had wanted to pursue and learn more about. And so years passed, and last fall, in October of 2019, there was a conference here in Fort Collins of the Society of Environmental Journalists, a big conference for writers and reporters who cover the environment. And I went out for margaritas with a group of reporters who I really admire and who I've wanted to work with for a long time, and told them about this phenomenon that I had been hearing about for a long time of private investment in water rights, not just in the Grand Valley, not just in Colorado, but sort of west-wide. This is a phenomenon that we've seen in a lot of states that rely on the Colorado River and places that aren't reliant on the Colorado River Basin. And out of that meeting with margaritas, we peeled off and decided to focus on a few different case studies of this phenomenon. Heather Sackett of Aspen Journalism and I decided to focus on the Grand Valley. We worked with Brett Jaspers at KJZZ, the NPR station in Phoenix, to look at some activity going on in the Colorado River main stem in Arizona and a suburb called Queen Creek, just south of Phoenix. And we worked with Daniel Rothberg, who is a reporter for the Nevada Independent, to look at some of water asset management's activities in the Humboldt River Basin in northern Nevada. And the process of doing the reporting started up in earnest soon after that initial meeting in October, doing interviews. Heather and I took quite a few road trips through the Grand Valley to do some on-the-ground reporting. This story took a lot of record collection in order to make certain statements about what actually was going on there. I think one of the big things that we wanted to be able to say by the end of the reporting was, this particular investment firm has spent X number of dollars buying X amount of land in this particular area. And to do that, you have to comb through a lot of property records. I got familiar with the Mesa County clerks and assessors' offices. And once we had a list of properties that had sold, we were able to pay people visits, reach out to people who had made this decision to sell their land and accompanying water rights to water asset management. And eventually we're able to track down a farmer who would agree to speak with us. His name is Zay Lopez. He ran a business called the Produce Peddler. If you live in the Grand Junction area or the Pinedale, Wyoming area, you might be familiar with his produce. He was a kind of a CSA and farmers market producer in the Mac area of the Grand Valley. And he happened to also be a real estate agent. And so he was kind of the perfect character to tell this story, because not only was he an agricultural producer, very shrewd guy, but he also had a knowledge of real estate and how real estate transactions work. And he'd been paying attention to some of the activity that water asset management had been up to in his neck of the woods pretty much ever since he'd been in business. And so by the time he was ready to sell, running a farmer's market farm, small acreage, just produce is pretty tough. And when he and his wife decided to sell their property, he approached water asset management because he knew that they were active in buying property in his area. And they finished the deal, and he's now growing hemp down in southern Colorado. But that was really what Heather and I needed in order to get the story off the ground and have a central character who had interactions with this investment firm. Because I don't want to speak for Heather, but I think both of us would say that this is maybe one of the more difficult stories that we've had to produce on the water beat in Colorado, because of the sensitivities around this particular issue. Like Andy said, there are implications for statewide for a demand management program when you start seeing, an investment firm from Manhattan buying agricultural land and water. It gives some people pause about whether demand management can actually work, and how can you keep agriculture from suffering while at the same time not making it a program so enticing that you are inviting investment from large-scale investment firms. And there are sensitivities within the community itself. Both Heather and I came across instances where people who had sold their land and water to water asset management were seen as social pariahs, people who were viewed as sellouts. One person we talked to said nobody wants to be seen or talk to him anymore because he had sold his land and water. And all of those factors combined made this a very difficult story to report, but we were glad that we were able to contribute to the conversation around water in the Grand Valley and water in the West in this particular way. And just some of our findings that I can go through really quickly. So we were able to fill in the gaps on those, how much money and how much land had been purchased. And we were able to say that water asset management has spent just above $16.5 million buying 2,222 acres of Grand Valley irrigated farmland. And not all of that is within the Grand Valley Water Users Association. Just recently, there was a purchase of land within the Grand Valley Irrigation Company's delivery area as well. But it's a significant amount of land. The Water Asset Management owns about 7% of the land that's irrigated by the government Highline Canal, which is the roller dam just off I-70. That's where it's diverted. And I think we feel pretty confident about those findings. Now, granted, that's since March of this year that we haven't updated those figures, so they could have changed since then. But that was what we were able to publish and contribute to the conversation as a part of that series that we published called Cash Flows, which I believe the link is in the Q&A now. And I'm looking forward to the rest of the discussion.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Luke. And I think your reporting was excellent. Your team, you and Heather and your compatriots did an excellent series. So thank you for reporting that. So I think the map that they produced is up on the screen today or now, and it shows the fairly significant investments underlying that government Highline Canal. One of the interesting points is that they are at Water Asset Management or its subsidiaries are now the single largest shareholder in the Grand Valley Water Users Association. So not a majority, but the single largest shareholder. And that also has implications for how that system is governed and operated. I do want to mention some things I forgot. One, that we are utilizing the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to take questions. We hope that between Luke and I and Representative Catlin, we'll be done talking and allowing for questions from the audience for the last 10 or 15 minutes. So if you have questions that you'd like us to answer, if you put them in the Q&A, we'll do our best to get to them. We'll also provide links with our email addresses so that you can reach out to us directly if we're unable to answer your questions or if there's something else that you want to communicate about. And then I also wanted to mention that we will, at the end of the program, make available the written answers that we got back from Mr. Disque Deane in Water Asset Management. When he declined to participate, he did send back some questions or some answers to some draft questions that I had said we would likely talk about today. So you'll get some direct feedback or be able to look that up if you so desire. We'll provide a link to those answers. The only other thing I forgot to mention, which I think my very hardworking staff at the Colorado River District will hold against me if I fail to, is that we do have our annual water seminar has been turned into a virtual event, a water week, zooming in on West Slope Water. And that is from September 21st through the 24th. That information is also available on our webpage. And again, our staff will post a link to that if you're interested. There are 4 days of different webinars at lunch, which we are excited to bring a variety of material to you. The next, I'd like to introduce Representative Marc Catlin. Mark, if you can turn your camera on. Well, Representative Catlin, I was hoping that you can provide your unique perspective as a lifelong participant in our farming community and on the West Slope, as well as someone who's been elected to our General Assembly. to represent one of our rural agricultural districts, and just help us understand maybe the concerns and thoughts, or whether they're positive or negative, about the type of activity that we're seeing as a result of these investments. So with that, Representative Catlin.
Thank you. Thanks for putting on this webinar, Zoom meeting. Zoom in and see you guys. And you know, this is an issue in the western slope of Colorado, particularly, that it concerns me. It also, you know, I look at, here's an opportunity. One of the things that I don't want to do is I don't want to step in between growers, agricultural producers, and their 401ks. They've paid for a long time on those places, and they now own them. And if the kids don't want to move on in ag, then something's got to happen. So this may be part of that potential future. But when we start talking about demand management, I think one of the things that happens is that most growers are not going to be, they're not going to see how they're going to be able to do that. An investment firm may see that that's an opportunity for them to help with, after they've acquired a ranch or a farm, this is a way to keep that thing cash flowing. What concerns me is that we as a community think about what we're going to do as far as this year, next year, and the year after, what crops we're going to raise, how we're going to raise them, what it's going to cost, those kind of things. But we don't talk about the communities that support those producers. If you don't farm a specific acre, then there's no investment put into that, and that lack of investment is what's worrying me, is that it will cascade down the main street. If you don't have to buy seed, fertilizer, fuel, all of the inputs that go into agriculture, then you're not going to be down at the supply houses, you're not going to be at your co-op buying those products, and pretty soon they're going to feel like, well, we've got too many people working for us, we don't have that much business. So a layoff happens there. Pretty soon they're not buying shoes, they're not buying the other things that they buy, and it goes right down Main Street until pretty soon we've cut our community activity, maybe by whatever percentage it is of the amount of ground that we're not farming. I think that's something we probably in Colorado should need to think about, is the community aspect along with the private property aspect of the growers deciding they want to do something different. But it's going to take a conversation between everyone in order to see what this future is going to look like. One of the things that concerns me is, and I've mentioned this a number of times, we continue to talk about a problem that appears to be a long-range problem. Climate change, if you want to call it that, you know, drought seasons, those kind of things. And we're not talking about permanent solutions. This demand management is what's considered a temporary solution. And I'm afraid we're focusing on a temporary solution for maybe a permanent problem. And if that's the case, we're only buying some time. If we're going to buy time, it should be that we are doing it for a very specific reason, for a specific amount of time, and that the community, the state of Colorado, the upper basin of the Colorado River, have decided that we want to do something on a permanent basis, which would mean more storage in our areas. Because if we're going to try to deal with this, we need to be storing water. And temporarily fixing the problem is really pretty cheap compared to what it would cost to build new reservoirs and storage for the communities and for agriculture. I think we need to be having that conversation all along with this demand management. Because if we're going to think that demand management is going to solve this problem for the next 50 years, I don't think we're looking at that. I don't think this is the answer. If we could say this was a 5-year fix or a 10-year fix, maybe then we could start to talk about this and explore it a lot bigger. But right now, all of the news that we're hearing, we've got 20 years of experience how much longer can this last? And I think that's one of the things that I would like to see come out of this. The other thing is that a lot of folks in Colorado, and over in the legislature, they talk about corporate farming. We don't want corporate farming. Well, I don't think that a lot of people that are not involved in agriculture, I don't think they realize that these are family corporations. And they've been formed as a family corporation for taxes and for inheritance purposes. They're not your typical corporation that buys and sells on the stock market or all those kind of things. They're limited liability corporations, but they get swept under the cover of being corporate. If we are going to get into the situation where these are such good investments that folks from outside of the community, from New York City, can afford to buy these farms and ranches, we are hurrying Colorado to turn into a corporate farming state. And corporate farms operate completely different than family farms do, because they've got other assets in other parts of the country that can help cover a loss in Colorado or a loss on this valley or in that valley, where family farms don't do that. The only way they cover the loss is by having less of a Christmas party for their families. And that's something I think we're losing fact of. Ag is a tough deal. You need to understand that right now, agriculture is really in deep trouble. Even though prices in the grocery store are going up, I've watched the price of hamburger go up double since COVID started in some instances. But the grower is not being paid more. In fact, they're being paid less. On our farm, we put last year's pinto beans. We raised a lot of pinto beans here. The price that we were offered and the price that we put them into storage at was a 1983 price. That's shocking when you think about it, because the only thing that's keeping agriculture in business today is that we're producing more per acre. It's how many pounds do you put in storage? And that's what's been the margin that's been keeping some of these farms and ranches going, is that we raise more today than we did in 1983 because of better seeds, better ways of farming it, and those kind of things. When you talk about corporate farming, they look at the bottom line. If they decide, hey, wait, we're not making any money in Western Colorado, it's an easy place for us, let's rent the water off and let it set for a few years, then we'll come back and see what's going on at that time. We don't have that. Agriculturalists don't really have that option. The other thing that's concerning to me in regards to demand management conversations is that we seem to be approaching demand management from a municipality way of doing business. It's almost as though we offer an RFP and then ag bids against itself. I bid against my neighbor. You say it's $400 an acre you can follow. I say $375. I'm the winning bid. That doesn't help ag. This asset is something that, we need to be thinking about. How can agriculture set the market rather than the beneficiaries of our water? Because if we go along with allowing the municipalities and the end users to set the price is going to continue to go down. We've seen that out in California in some of those fallow programs. The cities put out the bid packet. People decided, okay, I can do it for this amount. Well, they run that for about 10 years, and then all of a sudden the cities come into those areas and start buying those farms up because they say, look, we can't afford to continue to rent this water. We need to own it and firm up our yield. Well, if Colorado is going to follow that way, I think we're just putting off more and more ground being idled. None of us in Colorado want to go down the road of buy and dry. We've seen what's happening in the Arkansas Valley. But in a lot of ways, it's still the same thing. It's like lease and cease. You lease the water and cease farming. It's still blank ground out here. And, one of the things that's coming to the front is that some of this ground that's been fallowed for years, it takes a number of years to rehabilitate the ground with the microbes and all of the things that make that soil productive, it takes 2 or 3 years of farming it before it comes back to being what it was when you fallowed it. The other thing that we've got is that we've got weeds. You know, it's a fact of life. Weeds will grow even if you don't irrigate. And, you know, in order to get some of those farms back, and this has happened in my family, in order to get that farm back, you had to use a lot more herbicides on that ground to get the ground back to where you could raise corn and do those kind of things. So there was a lot more Roundup Ready corn and some of those kind of things that were planted in those acres. That with, you know, we're all hearing the news in regards to Roundup. So there's a lot of issues that need to be discussed in regards to demand management. How does that work for the state of Colorado? How long are we planning on doing it? Who are the beneficiaries? How do we set the market? Who drives the market? You know, is the state of Colorado going to get into the market of paying out money from the taxes of the state of Colorado to fallow acreage? Well, when we start doing that, what happens to the fairness factor in that? That's going to be in rural Colorado, where urban Colorado is going to be the people that really benefit from that. Because what we're really talking about is not a trans-mountain diversion, but letting water stay in the river to go to Lake Powell or to on down. That's going to protect trans-mountain diverters first. They'll be the first beneficiary of that if it gets low enough that we really need to start moving water down there. I think the other thing is that there's a lot of folks that are looking at demand management as an opportunity rather than a necessity for the state of Colorado. As we move forward in these drought seasons, that necessity will probably get to move to the front. You know, this summer, for example, we started out thinking we were a normal year. By the time we got to this snowstorm, we knew it was not a normal year. Our runoff did not match up with what we'd gotten because of the heat and the wind and all the things that happened. So it's so much of a moving target. I hate to just sit back and say, we're going to do demand management regardless. This is what we're going to do, because I think what it does, it makes a lot of communities unaware of what could be going on out at the edge of town, because agriculture is one of those industries that quietly does its job out at the edge of town. You don't know it's there until it's gone. And I'd like to kind of raise the flag some to make this more of a community-wide discussion rather than simply producer and the person who's going to benefit from it. Because I'm not sure how we would be able to demand management if you were to say that 20% of the acreage in any irrigation company is now under fallow. Would we do that management at the primary head gate or at the head gates of each farm? Because if it's done at the primary head gate, for example, here in the Uncompahgre at the Gunnison Tunnel, and leave the water in the Gunnison River, that 20% short of the water right will end up being much more than that as that water percolates and travels down through the irrigation system, because those shortages get multiplied as people consume the water that they were going to consume anyway. So there's got to be some real thought done in regards to which head gates are going to be shorted. Will they be done by the irrigation company, or will they be done at the irrigation head gate at the primary diversion point? Those questions really need to be figured out before we start pursuing this much deeper.
Well, Representative Catlin, yeah, thank you very much. That you raised a whole host of questions that still remain to be answered during this during the study of demand management and whether or not our state even desires to set something up. I did want to ask, I wanted to go back to Luke. Luke, you know, in your investigation, is it clear what water asset management is doing with their agricultural properties today? I understand that they're not actually being actively fallowed today. but they're being farmed. But who's farming them, and what are the changes that you were able to see on the ground with this new owner?
What we could learn without talking to water asset management directly, we spoke to one of their representatives, their lawyer, James Eklund, in the process of doing this, and had some off the record discussions with them. But what we were able to learn is they're basically being treated like tenant properties. So they're being leased to local farmers, to sometimes even to the people who had sold the land. So we found a couple instances where people had sold and then became the tenant farmer for their old property almost immediately. And we were never quite able to pin down exactly what the strategy is in order to make the kind of investment return that you would expect an investment firm of this size to expect. There were investments in some properties with irrigation efficiency, putting in, more efficient irrigation systems in order to use less water. But it's unclear right now what opportunities there are to make money off of that saved water, how you could turn an irrigation efficiency into a way to make money. We weren't able to figure that out, and because we weren't able to speak with water asset management directly on the record, we weren't able to get an answer to that particular question for this story. There was lots of speculation as to what they were up to, but there's still a bit of a question mark. And I think it would maybe take some changes in state law, different policies regarding, the Grand Valley Water Users Association bylaws. I mean, there's changes that would have to be made, I think, in order for some of that money-making potential to be realized.
Well, and I wanted to there are a couple of things you mentioned in there that I wanted to hit on. If I understand correctly, you said you did try to reach the principals in water asset management, but weren't able to talk with them on the record. And instead you were directed to talk to their legal counsel. Is that correct? Mm-hmm. Okay. And then, I think your article mentioned that there were some center pivots going in on some of their properties that they'd invested in. And you mentioned just now the irrigation efficiencies. And I think a number of folks in the water world understand this. Certainly, I think farmers and ranchers have seen this, is that when you install those efficiencies that improve the delivery of that water, it cuts down on the amount of water you have to deliver to the farm because you don't have to flood irrigate the entire pasture. But my understanding of the science is that by being more efficient in your application of water on a crop, you generally increase the consumptive use of that crop because you grow more. I mean, the biggest consumptive use in growing a crop is the actual plant, the evapotranspiration off the plant. So what you've described that you saw doesn't actually reduce the consumptive use. It either keeps it the same or increases it. So there's, from my perspective at the River District, that's not a conserved consumptive use situation. That's just merely making your application of water more efficient and maybe growing more crop. But like you said, it's hard to understand how that would result in a water savings that could somehow be beneficial or be paid for as a conserved consumptive use situation. Is that accurate?
Yeah, and I mean, some of the sources who we talked to for this story said that that water asset management doesn't have the long-term agricultural health of these communities in mind. That really the long game that goes unsaid is buy these agricultural properties that have really old senior water rights and sit on them, lease them back to farmers for however long you need to until that asset becomes highly valuable. And it looks good to install new, efficient irrigation, but really it's about this sort of wait and see approach, to wait for scarcity to take over, the entire basin, and all of a sudden you're able to sort of either sell or lease these water rights again and flip them into something that's more profitable. Now, I think water asset management would push back against that characterization, but that's definitely the feeling that some people have about what they're doing.
Well, in fact, I think some of the answers that will be posted from Mr. Deane that he provided, he does indicate that they're advocating for rotational fallowing programs and applauding the state for pursuing a demand management program, which would indicate their interest in participating in such a market. And I think it would be helpful to understand that you can invest in agriculture, and I think Representative Catlin touched on this. But if there's no ready market to transfer your water or lease your water to a third party, and in these programs or areas like the Grand Valley Water Users or the Uncompahgre Valley Water Users, they're federal projects with the water tied to the land. So it's not easy to sever that water from the land. But there seems to be a longer game involved in anticipating the ability to participate in this fallowing program that frankly the Bureau of Reclamation that runs these programs, or they are the overseer, federal trustee, if you will, of these programs or these operations, along with the states. There's some belief that we're moving towards that market-based economy in the water world in Western Colorado, and making investments in the current operations to keep them having some income as a landlord to agricultural uses makes sense. I'll tell you, I mean, I've had some conversations with Mr. Deane and some of his representatives, and I've often asked the same question I think you raised, Luke, which is, if they can figure out a way to make the kind of returns that investors on Wall Street typically want to see, it would be great for farmers and operators like Mark and his family to understand that and be able to do the same. And at least so far, that's been viewed as kind of a proprietary information on behalf of water asset management. They haven't really been interested in sharing their overall long-term plan. But I think, Mark, you can speak to the idea, if I'm not mistaken, your family's owned your farmland for at least a few generations. And no offense, but it doesn't occur to me or appear to me that you're overly rolling in cash. And so do you have any idea as to how one takes that investment and actually turns it into that golden goose that so many of us might enjoy if we were looking to do something?
Well, those are the kind of things that we think about almost every year. How could we do this better? How could we make it work better? Converting from gravity-fed, gravity flow, flood irrigation to systemized irrigation. To begin with, the crops that we raise in this valley are not going to make the payments on those kind of improvements. There are some onions that are being raised in the Uncompahgre Valley with drip tape and pumps. But the way that you do that is that you double or triple the population count on each seed bed. And then you irrigate it with underground drip tape. Overhead sprinklers, our soil types are, well, we've got a lot of adobe clay in all of these soils, even that up here on the mesas, but down down closer to the river, it's an adobe clay. When water falls on it, it creates a thick crust that a lot of seeds will have a hard time coming up through. After they're up, you can probably irrigate them. But one of the things I think that a lot of folks that are uninitiated, when we talk about we're going to use half the water, the Bureau even puts this out, that it'll use half the water. sprinkler systems. What they're really talking about is our crops will use the same amount of water regardless of how it's delivered. The savings will come in the water that's transporting the water to the field to be consumed, because that's what we have here is tailwater. My tailwater gets back into the system and is resold again to somebody downstream from me as headwater. With sprinkler systems, we don't have that return flow. And the other thing is when we talk about it, I think a lot of folks that are not irrigators think that, well, that's the water that you could sell, or that's the water that you could rent. That's not the case. In Colorado, the only water that we're going to be able to do any transactions with is that consumptive use. And a lot of these efficiency does not equal conservation. When you sprinkle, when you use systemized irrigation, you probably irrigate more often than you do when you give the soil a deep soaking to where the roots stand in moist soils. You have to continue irrigating it just like you do in your lawn. When you sprinkle your lawn, you don't use less. The hotter it gets, the more you use for consumptive use. So we're really not talking the same things when people start talking to me. Well, Mark, you could always rent off some of that water that you run off the tail of your place. That's all part of the system. My water floats in that water, and my water floats in the neighbor's water, and theirs floats in mine, and that's part of this delivery system. So we're not just talking about on the farm delivery system. It seems to me like the low-hanging fruit for most irrigation practices in the western slope of Colorado is in the delivery system rather than in on-farm improvements. And, you know, I don't think we're going to get outside investment firms to be doing that. That's something the state probably should start looking at. If we're going to talk about conserved water, the state needs to come to the table and talk about how do we conserve water in the delivery systems before it gets to the on-farm delivery or on the on-farm use. So that's really where I'm coming from.
Representative Catlin, I do have a question. I'm looking at some of the questions from our audience, and I just want to try to bring some of those in. And Representative Catlin, this was one that I had as well. And I think you were a sponsor of Senate Bill 2048 this year. I think it's a panel to study potential speculation issues in the state of Colorado. That I think came out of some concerns from West Slope legislators about investments like this. Can you describe that bill and maybe what you hope to learn through the operations of that commission that's been set up?
Well, yeah, what happened was we were hearing news about these investment firms and folks, not just in the Grand Valley, but up the North Fork of the Gunnison and some of those places, people buying properties that did not appear to be typical ag producers, more what we would consider speculators. The Constitution says you can't speculate on water, you can't use it. If you can't use it, you can't own it. What we're trying to do is to take a look under this study as to how Colorado is going to need to evolve to where we start looking at, as these marketplaces, potential marketplaces start to open up, what can be done. You know, when I'm on a study bill, I try not to say this is what I want you to study, because I don't want to, you know, limit it. What we're trying to find out is what can be done in Colorado in this market in the modern world for speculation. Because we, as you all know, we are the water capital. This is where it starts. We have the high, you know, we're where water is stored all winter up there in that snowbank. So it's a great place to start speculating is right here. So what we're hoping to be able to do is to find out how is it being done, what's being done about it, is there something could be done. Maybe one of the things that we start to think about is that are the communities that send water downstream, are they potential to be injured parties in change of use? So those are the kind of things we're looking at.
Well, and I wanted to ask both of you and see if either of you have run into this. I understand from my own experience and role at the River District that WAM's representatives have had direct conversations with a number of front range utilities looking at whether there is a market for this water in the event that there's a compact curtailment, and whether or not that water could be used to protect a junior front range diverter's use of water. Have either of you looked at this, and maybe Representative Catlin, if you could speak to whether or not that's an appropriate issue to study for this commission that's been set up under Senate Bill 48?
Well, I would imagine that it would be a legitimate study, something to talk about. As far as me knowing personally that they've had conversations with those folks, I don't, but if I were an owner, that's one of the places that I would be talking. You know, I would have had conversations with people that if this happens, would you be interested? I think that's one of the things that we in ag and we on the Western Slope are always concerned about, is that senior water rights on the Western Slope of Colorado are going to be used to protect juniors. And, you know, that takes the prior appropriation doctrine and turns it straight up on its head. I've continued to say that, you know, if the juniors want protected, they need to be able to say to us, we are willing and able to save X amount if you guys can help with that. That's that equitable thing that we've talked about in regards to demand management. As time goes on, you know, grandma's supper and the baby's bottle are still going to be priority uses for the state of Colorado. I'd like to get out in front of that so that none of our folks over here, particularly my constituents or my neighbors, friends, and relatives, end up being injured by those kind of practices.
Well, I wonder, Luke, the River District has looked at this issue and suggested that if a demand management program is set up, that it appears that it should be done in a guided market sense with one buyer, maybe the state of Colorado through the CWCB, being the market setter at a price that's fair and respectful to and works for the family farm producer, but doesn't create incentive for outside investment. I have had conversations with WAM's representatives that have pushed back and said, no, we think it should be multiple buyers in the marketplace. And did you get into any of that in your reporting? Did you hear that discussion? What if so, what did you hear?
We did a little bit. I mean, it's hard because demand management is theoretical still. And, you know, you have 10 or more work groups that are looking at all these various aspects of demand management. And so there's so much up in the air of exactly what that program would or could look like. But yeah, I mean, if you're setting up a marketplace, you want to set a market that that gives you the greatest return on your investment. If you're you know, an investment firm, why would you want to set up a market that gives you a lower price? You want one that gives you a higher price point for your asset. One of the things that we kept running across in this is, you know, I think farmers feel, rightfully so, a lot of protective feelings for their livelihood. And this particular investment firm, but they're not the only ones, who make an argument that it's unfair to differentiate between agricultural producers and investment firms like theirs. That, you know, they would maybe even say, like, people who have this outdated notion of a farmer as like a guy in coveralls, you know, with a cow and a tractor, you know, these are savvy business people, and this investment firm just happens to be, you know, the next sort of iteration of that. And that if a state or a basin is trying to, you know, differentiate, we want this particular marketplace to benefit this participant and not benefit this participant, then that's not going to be fair. And that there's kind of, you know, they would make the argument that, like, there really isn't a difference between an investment firm and an agricultural producer. I mean, they said that as much, like, don't differentiate because our tenant farmers are, you know, we're leasing back to farmers. We're part of the same agricultural community that you say that you're trying to protect.
Well, it's interesting you bring that up because we along with our partners, the Colorado River District participates in something called the Water Bank Work Group. And we've been studying the potential secondary economic impacts of a demand management market. And looking at that, our report should be out either later this week, which I think gives me only one day, or early next week. And really one of the big assumptions that our economics firm had to make was that that they had to look at it from an owner-producer perspective, because if it's an owner and a producer who lives in the community, the effects on the community of fallowing for pay really brings that money back into circulation within the same community. On the other hand, it's a tenant farming situation like that at WHAM. If that land is fallowed, those tenants are out of business. They're not making money. They're not paying their bills with that income. They're not buying things with that income at the local stores. And the money, if in the instance of an outside investment firm based in New York, that money's not coming back into the community. So our economic impact study doesn't really look in depth at that. And I think it's one of those things that, Luke, as you properly identified, we're going to have to get into, because it has a hugely different impact on our local communities if this program moves forward. If Mark's land is fallowed and he's being paid for it, he's still going to go to the local Chevy dealer, or I don't know, maybe you're a Ford guy, and go buy a truck. You know, he's not going to take that money necessarily out of the area. I want to ask if either of you know if the WHAM properties, this is a question that is being posed, are any of them being converted to growing new crop varieties? In other words, switching, there's a lot of discussion about crop switching and whether or not you can engage in water conservation through that. Have you seen any of that, Luke, in your reporting on WHAM? Any evidence of that?
I think we asked, but again, we did most of the reporting earlier this year and that in the before times. And so, yeah, I just don't recall if we saw like changes in cropping patterns or not.
Fair enough. And Representative Catlin, I know there's quite a bit of crop switching, if you will, going on or was going on down in the Uncompahgre Valley recently with the introduction of hemp on drip tape. Is that still progressing without the presence of WHAM or other investment vehicles?
Well, here in the Uncompahgre Valley, we had some substantial acreages of hemp last year, but after the crash of the hemp market, there's not nearly as much hemp being grown here now. We've proven that we can raise it. We've proved that we can raise so much of it that the price will go down to nothing. There's not a lot of crop switching because one of our problems is, who do we sell it to? We don't have processors. We're still, the primary crop in the Uncompahgre is hay and alfalfa, along with corn. And sweet corn is something that we raise, but it's such a specialty item. There's only about 2,500 acres or so in the Uncompahgre Valley of sweet corn, even though it's our marquee crop. It makes a lot of advertisements and a lot of news, Olathe sweet and those kind of things. Changing crops is something that I've tried to think about for a long time. New crops and new markets. It may be easier for us if we could find new markets for what we do raise. But alfalfa hay exported, pinto beans is another big crop. Pinto beans don't use an awful lot of water because they come up late, harvest early. Grain crops are historically what we've used to give each individual farm a little boost in water. That you plant it early in the spring, you harvest it in about July, late July. Then that ground doesn't need water, so the rest of the farm ground that you're growing a crop on can use the water that came from that. but grains and those kind of things are so low in price that we just simply can't. They're so low that you can't afford to raise them. New crops would be something, but it's going to, everybody's going to have to be involved in new crops because you've got to have a way to process them and get them out of here, whether it's just put them in a box and then ice it like we do sweet corn, or if you could add value, a canning factory or, you know, those kind of things. But investments like that are few and far between. We're not finding them here.
Thank you. And I will say, just from my own observation, that it doesn't appear to be that the tenants are switching or experimenting with crop switching. And I don't know that they would have any incentive to do so as a tenant necessarily. So it doesn't seem, and that certainly wasn't apparent by the answers provided by WHAM. I think the one last subject, we have just a little bit of time. You know what, there's the whole concept of really doing an ag to urban transfer here through a demand management program, or even an upper basin to lower basin transfer through the storage account in Powell. And I think we've all touched on that today a little bit, but I think there's something more for the local community, and I wonder, you know, Luke, you touched on this, and Mark, so did you, but maybe Luke, if you could go first, and then Mark. There's a human aspect of this, that the community itself has historically been local family farmers working within their community and participating as community members. And while many of those tenants are still doing that, the owners of the land are no longer the same. And what is it, you know, Luke, did you pick up something in your reporting that really spoke to that cultural shift, that is this a watershed moment in Western Colorado agriculture, that we're seeing a shift away from family owned and operated businesses?
Yeah, I mean, we heard that over and over, and I mentioned at the beginning how difficult it was to do this reporting, and it's because of how sensitive this particular topic is for people who've made the decision to sell land and water. I don't think it's easy for anyone who has made that decision, whether you're an irrigated farmer in Western Colorado or anywhere across the country. I mean, people feel this very strong connection to the land, especially if you've been tending it for multiple generations. I mean, that's a monumental decision that you're going to make in your life, no matter the amount of money that you're getting paid to do it. And so there's just like a huge emotional resonance around this particular issue because the decision feels so weighty, and it's not just an individual decision, it's sort of a community decision as well. You look at an area like the Grand Valley, I mean, it's so rooted in this agricultural identity. And it's not that maybe agriculture is disappearing right now, these properties are still being farmed, but who owns it and who participates in agriculture, I think, you know, that defines what a community is. And if you have an investment firm that owns, you know, a significant portion of the land and becomes this kind of player within the broader agricultural community, that's going to change how people feel about the place that they're from and live in. And so, yeah, that's a huge shift, I think, for people, and why, you know, you see an intense interest in this particular topic, because it feels like a large shift is taking place. And I think, especially when so much money is involved, people feel like it's greater than what they can stop or change, or, you know, it's like, how do you as an individual farmer compete with a hedge fund from New York City? You feel sort of helpless if you see your community changing in that way that you don't agree with. But like Representative Catlin said, at the same time, you don't, as an individual farmer, you don't want anyone telling you what you can and cannot do with the land that you own. And so that's a tension that I think a lot of agricultural producers feel all the time.
And I think, Luke, that's a really good point. It's that individual right and individual property ownership versus a community ethos. And maybe Representative Catlin, maybe we can focus on that for a minute. There's something about a state design market potentially funded by public dollars that would drive potentially this change in these communities, the change from local ownership to investor ownership, that I think is rubbing a lot of people on the West Slope in the wrong way. And so how is it that you at the legislature, me at the Colorado River District, you in your role as a director on the River District, what can we do to make sure that we're not using public funds and a public policy to materially change our communities? What are your thoughts, Representative Catlin?
Well, I think that's one of the things that we're suffering from in a lot of ways. Public dollars are being spent in places that a lot of people don't agree with. The idea that we would enhance a marketplace for the benefit of investors versus agriculturalists is worrisome to me. It seems to me if we need to do some of this demand management, maybe what should be done is that the people that own the land are given some tax credits or some things like that that might help local people more than just writing checks. Like I've spoken about before, if we're going to do these kind of things, I think that the public money might be spent better in building infrastructure that would make long-term answers for the communities in Colorado, rather than simply changing a marketplace to where it would enhance buying and investing. One of the things I wanted to mention about earlier in the conversation, in the Uncompahgre Valley, we have a substantial number of non-farm owners, because since a lot of people don't grow up to want to be farmers, there are people that have inherited farms, their family farms, from their parents or from their grandparents, and they rent them out today. But they are mostly not the kind of people that have stepped in and bought farmland as an investment. They're people that are still connected to those farms. Either they were dads or grandpas or, whatever. What's happening today is that none of these farms that you could inherit would make two people a living. So a lot of times mom and dad decide that they'll sell the farm so that they can split the money between the kids that decided they didn't want a farm. And what we've been able to do in a lot of cases in the Uncompahgre is those places have sold to the neighbors or have sold to some other farm family in the community. But when we get people that are buying for investment, and this is one of the things I think is a nuance, if you can be paid $500 an acre for not farming it, or paid $100 an acre to rent it to a farmer, a tenant farmer, the decision is already made. That is one place I think we need to be thinking about public money. Maybe there are some programs that can be created that will allow that ground to stay farming rather than being fallowed with public money. I would say again that I think that the state of Colorado should be taking a good hard look at delivery systems and the water that's saved in those delivery systems. We should find a way that we can store it, or that we get the direct benefit as the state of Colorado in regards to public money expenditure, rather than paying for not farming a piece of ground.
Well, I think our time's up. Representative Catlin, I really appreciate you participating. Luke, I appreciate your participation and your reporting. I know there are a number of questions we weren't able to answer, and I apologize to those folks that we haven't. Again, our emails have been posted on the chat, along with links to the various topics that we've talked about, Luke's reports or reporting. We really, this has been a valuable conversation for me, and gentlemen, I really appreciate your involvement today. thank you very much for the things that both of you do. So we'll see you around. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, everybody, for tuning in.
See you.